The cowboy heard one sentence inside the saloon that night, and by sunrise he was standing in front of a widow's dying ranch. Snow slammed against the barn doors while Abby Whitmore pressed both hands against her son's freezing face. Outside, somewhere beyond the white darkness, a horse screamed into the storm. Wade Coulter staggered through the gate with blood on his knuckles and ice frozen into his coat. And nobody in Red Hollow yet knew why someone wanted the widow's ranch dead so badly. If this story pulls you in, stay a while and ride with us. Winter came early to Bitterroot Valley that year. By the second week of October, the wagon road into Red Hollow had already turned to black mud under thin crusts of ice. Wind pushed down from the mountains hard enough to rattle loose boards and make lantern flames tremble behind glass. Folks in town started speaking shorter, walking faster, pulling coats tighter around their necks. At the Whitmore Ranch, the cold seemed to settle deeper than anywhere else. Abigail Whitmore stood beside the west trough before sunrise, one gloved hand resting on the frozen wood while the horses drank slowly, or tried to. A gray mare lifted her head after only 2 swallows and limped away stiff-legged across the yard. Abby watched her go without moving. The lantern hanging beside the barn door threw weak yellow light across the frost. She could already see the pale crust around the edges of the trough again. Mineral stains, bitter residue, the same thing she'd been seeing for months. Behind her, the old water pump groaned once inside the dark, a long metal complaint that echoed through the sleeping ranch. Ben came out carrying a bucket of feed grain against his hip, 11 years old and already walking like a ranch hand instead of a child. "You slept at all?" he asked. "A little. That mare's worse. I know." Neither said anything after that. The horses had been getting sick one by one since summer. First came the stiffness in the legs, then the loss of appetite. Then 2 geldings went down entirely before September ended. Abby had hired 3 different men to inspect the well line running beneath the west pasture. All 3 had stood with their thumbs hooked in their belts and said nearly the same thing. Bad season, hard ground, early frost, nothing unusual, but Abby knew this land too well to believe that. She had lived on it 12 years, buried her husband on the hill above it 3 winters ago. She knew how the water should smell after snowmelt. She knew the color healthy horses left in their buckets. She knew the west well had changed, and she knew nobody in town wanted to say it out loud. By noon, she rode into Red Hollow, with a ledger wrapped in cloth beneath her coat, and 3 unpaid invoices folded inside it. The bank clerk barely looked at her while stamping another extension notice. "Mr. Hargrove can give you until Christmas," he said. "After that, he'll need a payment." She nodded once and folded the paper carefully. Outside, men stood under the awning beside the saloon smoking cigars against the cold. Their voices lowered when she passed, though not enough. "That ranch is finished. Herd pikes already waiting on the land. She won't make spring." Abby kept walking. At the feed store, Ezekiel Shaw loaded her grain slower than usual. He avoided her eyes while tying the sack closed. "You ought to think about reducing stock before winter gets worse," he muttered. "My stock's fine." Ezekiel pulled the knot tighter than needed. Didn't say otherwise. But he still didn't look at her. That hurt worse somehow. By evening, snow had started falling in thin, dry streaks across the valley. Ben finished feeding the horses while Abby stood alone inside the west barn checking another bucket. The water smelled faintly metallic tonight, like pennies left in rain. A horse shifted behind her. Another stamped nervously. Then, somewhere outside came the slow sound of hoofbeats approaching through snow. Abby straightened. Most folks didn't ride this far north after dark unless they needed something. She stepped toward the barn entrance just as a tall bay horse emerged through the blowing snow beyond the gate. The rider wore a weather-faded coat dusted white across the shoulders. Broad hat pulled low, bedroll tied behind the saddle. Not a local. The man stopped near the fence line and looked toward the trough before he looked at her. That caught her attention immediately. Most men looked at the widow first, then the ranch. This one studied the water. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into half-frozen mud, snow caught in the dark stubble along his jaw. His eyes moved once across the yard, the trough, the frost stains, the horses favoring their weight. Then they settled on Abby. "You Abigail Whitmore?" "Yes." He nodded once toward the trough. "Your west well's poisoned with mineral runoff." The wind moved hard through the barn opening. Abby said nothing. The stranger stepped closer, not enough to crowd her. "Whatever's upstream cracked open some time back," he said evenly. "Horse has been limping first before they stop eating." Her throat tightened before she could stop it. "Yes, water's turning bitter because the line's carrying through old rock deposits." His eyes shifted briefly toward the north ridge, probably from abandoned silver cuts higher up. Abby stared at him. No hesitation, no guessing, just the truth spoken plain after months of being told she imagined it. Behind her, appeared silently beside the stall door, watching the stranger with narrowed eyes. Snow hissed softly across the roof. Finally, Abby asked, "Who are you?" "Wade Coulter." "And how would you know any of that?" "Because I've seen it before." He glanced once toward the darkening sky, then back at the ranch. "And because your horses ain't dying from winter." The words stayed hanging in the cold air between them. Behind Wade, snow drifted sideways across the yard in thin white ribbons. Somewhere near the back fence, a loose gate chain knocked softly against wood. Abby crossed her arms tighter against the cold. "You a veterinarian?" she asked. "No, Mom." "Then why should I trust you?" Wade looked past her toward the west pasture, toward the dark shape of the old well house leaning slightly against the wind. "Don't know that you should yet." Ben shifted beside the stall door, watching him carefully. Most men in Red Hollow talked too much when they wanted something. They smiled too quickly, explained things before being asked. This man didn't. That bothered Abby almost as much as the fact he might be right. Wade stepped closer to the trough and dipped 2 fingers into the water. He rubbed them together once, then smelled them. "Copper," he muttered. "Maybe sulfur too." Abby felt her stomach tighten. Her husband, Thomas, had said almost those exact words the last spring before he died. She remembered him sitting at the kitchen table with muddy boots and tired eyes, staring at a hand-drawn map of the ranch. Something's wrong upstream. At the time, she'd thought there would be time to fix it. There hadn't been. "You said you've seen this before," Abby said quietly. "In northern Wyoming." Wade wiped his hand on his coat. Whole cattle spread nearly went under from runoff leaking through old mining cuts. "You can fix it?" "Maybe. Not yes, not promises. Just maybe." That honest answer landed harder than reassurance would have. The wind picked up sharper across the yard. One of the horses inside the barn stamped nervously. Wade glanced toward the mountains before speaking again. "Storm's turning worse. I can look at the line come morning if you want. And if I don't, then I ride on." Ben looked between them. Abby noticed Wade's saddle then. Worn bedroll, rope coil patched in 2 places, 1 extra shirt tied behind the cantle. A man carrying only what his horse could hold, a drifter. That should made the decision easy. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What would you want for the work?" Wade shrugged once. "Hot coffee now and a place in the barn tonight." Ben frowned immediately. Abby could feel it beside her. She studied Wade another moment. Snow melting slowly across the brim of his hat, exhaustion buried deep under the calm in his face. He looked like a man who had ridden a long time without stopping anywhere long enough to belong. Finally, she nodded once toward the far barn. "You can use the east stall. Keep clear of the horses." "Fair enough." Ben stayed silent while Wade led his horse through the gate. Inside the barn, lantern light swung gently from a hook overhead. The smell of hay, leather, and cold wood filled the air. Wade removed his saddle carefully and checked his horse's legs before anything else. Ben noticed that most men fed themselves first. "You always check the horse before supper?" Ben asked. Wade glanced over. "Horse carries you through snow country. You return the favor." Ben tried not to look impressed. Abby disappeared into the house without another word. An hour later, Wade sat alone on an overturned crate in the east stall eating stew from a chipped bowl. The barn walls groaned softly under the wind outside. Snow tapped against the roof in uneven bursts. The stew was simple: potatoes, salt pork, carrots cooked too long. Still better than most trail meals. He finished half before noticing the blanket folded near the stall door. Heavy wool, dark blue stitching around the edges. No note, no sound from the house. Just the blanket left there quietly while the storm deepened outside. Wade looked toward the faint light glowing through the kitchen window across the yard. Then, he set the bowl aside and pulled the blanket over his shoulders without a word. Inside the house, Abby stood at the sink, drying the same plate twice while Ben watched her from the table. "You trust him?" he asked. "No. Then why is he here?" She folded the towel slowly. Because for the first time in 6 months, somebody looked at the ranch instead of looking at her. But she didn't say that aloud. Instead, she blew out the lantern nearest the window. "Get some sleep, Ben." The boy hesitated. Then quietly, "He doesn't seem scared of the horses." Abby glanced once toward the barn through the dark glass. "No," she said softly. "He doesn't." Near midnight, the storm turned violent. Wind slammed against the barn, hard enough to shake snow loose from the rafters. Wade woke instantly at the sound of horses shifting restless in their stalls. He pulled on his coat and stepped into the aisle, just as part of the roof above the feed room gave a sharp cracking groan. One support beam had started splitting under wet snow weight. Wade grabbed a lantern and climbed the side ladder without hesitation. Outside, the cold hit like a fist. Snow whipped across the roof so thick he could barely see the yard below. He drove his shoulder against the beam, hammered a brace into place with numb hands, and tied the weakened section down with ranch rope while ice cut across his face. By the time he climbed back down, blood had opened across 2 knuckles where the hammer slipped. He barely noticed, but Abby did. She stood near the barn entrance, wrapped in her coat, lantern trembling slightly in her hand. "You could have broken your neck up there. Roof would come down on the horses." He reached for the water barrel. Abby caught his wrist before he could. The contact lasted only a second, still enough. She pulled a small whiskey bottle from her coat pocket and poured it over his split knuckles. Wade's jaw tightened once, but he didn't pull away. Neither of them spoke. The lantern crackled softly between them. Wind moved through the cracks in the barn walls. Somewhere behind them, Ben watched silently from the loft ladder, unseen by both of them. And for the first time since his father died, the ranch no longer felt entirely empty. Morning came gray and brittle over Bitterroot Valley. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the ranch buried beneath fresh snow that sparkled blue under weak sunrise. Smoke drifted slowly from the Whitmore chimney. Horses stamped against the cold inside the barn. Wade was already awake before daylight. Abby heard the steady chop of an axe outside while she tied her hair at the kitchen mirror. By the time she stepped onto the porch with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, he had split half a stack of frozen cedar beside the pump. Steam rose faintly from his back in the cold. "You didn't have to do that," she said. The woodpile was low. He said it without stopping. No performance in it, no expectation, just fact. Ben came out carrying 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one awkwardly toward Wade. The boy tried to look casual about it. Wade accepted the cup with a nod. "Appreciate it." Ben shrugged. "Ma made it." Abby pretended not to hear that part. The next few days settled into a rhythm nobody spoke about aloud. Wade worked the west line from sunrise until the light faded blue behind the mountains. He dug through frozen ground inch by inch, tracing the buried water route north toward the ridge. Some evenings he came back with mud frozen stiff across his boots and his gloves soaked through from snowmelt. Ben followed him whenever schoolwork allowed. At first the boy mostly watched. Then he started asking questions. What makes water turn bad? How deep's the line buried? What happens if the pressure freezes? Wade answered everyone seriously, never talking down to him, never brushing him aside. One afternoon, Abby looked up from repairing tack near the barn door and saw Wade showing Ben how to test pipe joints using warm water from a kettle. The boy's face held the kind of attention she hadn't seen in years. It frightened her more than she expected. That evening, she rode into Red Hollow for supplies. The roads were rough from the storm. Wagon wheels had frozen deep grooves into the mud before the overnight frost hardened everything solid. Her mare picked carefully around patches of black ice, while wind carried chimney smoke low through town. Inside Clara Boone's sewing shop, the air smelled like fabric starch and coal heat. Clara glanced up from hemming a winter coat. "Well now," she said lightly. "Folks say you've got yourself a ranch hand." Abby set a spool of thread on the counter. "Folks ought to find better things to do." Clara smiled without looking offended. "People notice things, that's all. He's fixing the water line." Clara folded fabric slowly. "And sleeping in your barn." The room went quiet except for the ticking stove. Abby reached for her gloves. "You planning to charge extra for thread or just conversation today?" Clara's expression softened a little. "I'm not judging you, Abby." But she was listening to everyone else. That was worse. By the time Abby left the shop, 2 women near the bakery window had already lowered their voices watching her pass. The whole town was beginning to turn its head toward the Whitmore ranch. Wade noticed it too. Men outside the saloon went quiet when he walked by the stockyard. Vernon Pike tipped his hat one afternoon with a smile, too polite to trust. "Heard you're settling in north of town," Vernon said. "Just working." Vernon glanced toward the mountains. Dangerous season to get attached to failing land. Wade held his gaze a moment too long, then walked on. That night, rain came instead of snow. Cold rain, heavy enough to drum hard against the roof and turn the yard into black mud again. Abby sat alone in the kitchen after Ben went upstairs. The oil lamp beside the stove burned low. A bookkeeping ledger lay open in front of her, beside unpaid feed receipts and a folded bank notice. She stared at the numbers until they blurred. Outside, wind rattled the loose shutter near the back room. Then quietly, before she could stop herself, she broke, not loudly. Just one hand pressed hard against her mouth while tears slipped loose anyway. "I can't keep losing things," she whispered into the empty kitchen. "I can't do it again." Rain tapped against the windows. The stove crackled softly. And from outside the back doorway, Wade stood frozen beneath the porch roof, having come only to return the lantern he borrowed from the barn. He stared down at the wet boards instead of looking inside. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he quietly set the lantern near the door and walked back toward the barn without making a sound. The next morning, he worked harder than before. By afternoon, the new line from the mountain runoff had finally started carrying clear water downhill toward the holding tank. Ben laughed out loud, watching fresh water spill clean into the trough for the first time in months. Even Abby smiled before catching herself. But that same night, long after dark, Wade heard something outside. Not wind, footsteps, fast. He grabbed the lantern and crossed the yard, just in time to catch movement near the north trench line beyond the fence. A shadow disappearing into the trees. Wade lifted the lantern higher. His stomach tightened instantly. The new water line had been smashed apart with a sledge. Water spilled black across the snow. For a second, Wade only stood there listening. The mountains were quiet again. Too quiet. Whoever had done it already knew the trails well enough to disappear into the timber before pursuit even crossed a man's mind. Behind him, the lantern hissed softly in the wind. Then Wade crouched beside the broken pipe. Fresh damage, fresh boot marks, deliberate. He touched the split metal once and looked toward the ridge above the ranch, where dark pines leaned against the night sky. Not weather, not accident. Somebody wanted the Whitmore Ranch dead. By dawn, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Clouds rolled low through Bitterroot Valley, thick and heavy as smoke. Folks in Red Hollow moved quicker that morning, boarding windows and tying down wagons ahead of the storm everyone could feel coming. At the ranch, Wade worked without stopping. He repaired the smashed section while freezing water soaked through his gloves and sleeves. Ben carried tools beside him in silence, cheeks red from cold. Abby brought coffee twice. The second cup stayed untouched until it turned lukewarm beside the trench. "You need sleep," she said quietly. "So do the horses." His hands were bleeding again by noon. This time Abby noticed he tried hiding it. That bothered her more than the blood itself. The storm reached them just before dark. Snow came sideways first, then wind hard enough to shake the stable doors against their hinges. Horses began stomping restless inside the barn before the worst of it even arrived. Wade secured lanterns low against the walls while Abby carried buckets from the emergency cistern near the kitchen shed. Ben disappeared sometime after supper. At first, Abby thought he was upstairs. Then she noticed his coat missing from the peg by the door. Her stomach dropped cold instantly. "Ben?" No answer. She checked the loft, the tack room, the shed behind the smokehouse. Nothing. Then she saw the small tracks leading away from the barn toward the north pasture gate already filling with snow. "He went after Scout," Wade said immediately. "The young colt, the one that slipped the fence during the afternoon wind." Abby grabbed her coat with shaking hands. "We have to go. You stay here." "I'm not staying while my son. You won't make 20 yards in this." The wind slammed hard against the porch as if proving him right. For one dangerous second, anger flashed across her face. Not because he was wrong, because she knew he wasn't. Wade pulled a lantern from the hook and wrapped a scarf across his mouth. "I'll bring him back." Abby caught his sleeve before he stepped into the storm. The contact stopped both of them. Snow hissed across the porch floor between their boots. "Please," she whispered. It was the first time she had asked him for anything. Wade held her eyes one long second, then nodded once and disappeared into the white dark beyond the yard. The storm swallowed him almost immediately. Hours crawled by after that. The kitchen clock ticked beside the stove while Abby sat fully dressed at the table, unable to keep still longer than a minute. Sometimes she stood at the window listening for hoofbeats. Sometimes she stepped onto the porch, only to be driven back by wind and ice. Then near midnight came pounding at the front door. Not Wade. Ezekiel Shaw stood there covered in snow, breathing hard. "You need to know something," he said. Abby stared at him. Ezekiel pulled off his gloves with stiff fingers. Vernon Pike paid men to keep that line broken. The room went still. "He knew about the runoff months ago," Ezekiel continued quietly. "Knew your well was bad. Figured winter'd force you to sell cheap by spring." Abby felt something inside her go very calm. Not surprise, not panic, something colder. Ezekiel looked ashamed, standing there beneath her lamplight. "I should've said something sooner." Outside, the storm screamed across the valley. Abby reached slowly for her coat again. 20 minutes later, the saloon doors burst open against the wind. Every head inside turned. Abigail Whitmore walked in carrying snow across the floorboards, cheeks pale from cold, eyes steady as iron. Vernon Pike sat near the stove, holding a whiskey glass halfway to his mouth. He smiled when he saw her. That smile disappeared quickly. "You waited for my ranch to die," Abby said. Nobody in the room moved. Vernon leaned back slowly. "Now hold on. You waited for it, like men wait for wolves to finish off a wounded horse." The piano player stopped entirely. Even the bartender froze with a rag in his hand. Abby stepped closer through the silence. "My husband built that land with his hands," she said softly. "And you stood back, hoping winter would bury the rest of us with it." Vernon opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because every man in that room already knew, and now she knew too. The saloon stayed silent long after she left. Near dawn, the storm finally weakened. The first sound Abby heard was pounding at the barn doors. She ran before the second knock came. Wade stumbled inside, carrying Ben wrapped beneath his coat and blanket both. Snow crusted thick across Wade's shoulders and beard. His lips had gone nearly blue from cold. Ben clung weakly to him. "We found shelter near Miller's Ravine," Wade managed roughly. Boy wouldn't leave the colt. Abby pulled Ben into her arms so fast, the lantern nearly fell from its hook. Her son buried his freezing face against her shoulder. Behind them, Wade braced one hand against the wall, suddenly unsteady. Only then did Abby realize he had spent the whole night shielding Ben from the storm with his own body. She looked at him differently after that. Not like a drifter, not like hired help, like someone the ranch itself had chosen to keep. Morning light finally crept pale through the barn cracks. Ben sat wrapped in blankets near the stove, while Abby poured coffee with trembling hands. Wade stood near the stall, doorway staring out at the snow-covered yard. Quiet filled the barn. Then Ben looked up sleepily and said the word before thinking. "Pa?" The silence afterward felt almost sacred. Ben's eyes widened instantly. Abby froze beside the stove. Wade turned slowly from the doorway. Nobody spoke, but none of them could quite pretend they hadn't heard it. The fire cracked softly inside the barn stove while snowmelt dripped steady from Wade's coat onto the floorboards. Ben sat stiff beneath the blankets, staring hard into the tin cup between his hands, as though he might hide inside it. Abby looked down first. "I'll warm more water," she said quietly. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. She disappeared into the house without waiting for an answer. Wade stayed where he was near the doorway, one hand braced against the stall post. Exhaustion sat heavy on him, now that the danger had passed. His face looked drawn from cold and lack of sleep. Ben finally glanced up. "I didn't mean..." The boy swallowed hard. "I wasn't thinking." Wade nodded once. "I know." Another silence settled. Then Wade crossed slowly toward the stove and crouched near him. "Your father's still your father, Ben." The boy's jaw tightened immediately. "I know that too." Wade rested his forearms against his knees, looking into the fire instead of at him. "My old man died when I was younger than you," he said after a while. Spent years half forgetting the sound of his voice. He shrugged slightly. "Didn't make him less mine." Ben studied him carefully then, not like a child anymore, like somebody measuring truth. By spring, Bitterroot Valley began thawing around the edges. Snow loosened first along the fence lines. Then the wagon roads softened into dark mud beneath wagon wheels and hoofprints. Water rushed hard through the mountain runoff north of the ranch, cold and clear now that Wade's new line held steady. The horses stopped limping. One morning Abby stood beside the trough, watching a chestnut mare drink deep for nearly a full minute without pulling away. She closed her eyes briefly after the horse wandered off, healthy and calm. Just 1 second, then she went back to work. Life on the ranch slowly found rhythm again. Ben laughed more often. The sound startled Abby every time. Sometimes she'd hear him and Wade outside repairing fence posts, or arguing over saddle straps while sunlight spilled across the yard. Once she caught herself standing at the kitchen window listening instead of moving. That frightened her still. Not because things were bad, because they were beginning to feel good. Red Hollow noticed too. Folks who once crossed the street to avoid conversation now tipped hats toward Abby in town. Buyers started asking about Whitmore horses again. Even the bank clerk sounded different handing her receipts across the counter. Vernon Pike stopped speaking when she entered rooms. That suited her fine. Summer arrived green across the valley. Grass rolled thick over the southern pasture clear to the creek bend. Wildflowers pushed up beside the wagon trail. And for the first time in years, the Whitmore Ranch no longer looked like a place barely surviving winter. It looked alive. Then one evening in July, Abby found Wade standing alone near the barn saddling his horse. The sight hit her strangely hard. "You leaving?" she asked. Wade tightened the saddle strap once before answering. "Was thinking about it." The words landed quiet between them. Beyond the pasture, cicadas buzzed in the evening heat. The old water pump clanked steady behind the house, while Ben watered horses near the fence line. Abby folded her arms. "The ranch still needs work. It'll manage. You rebuilt half of it. And you kept the other half standing before I got here." He finally looked at her then. Same calm eyes, same steady expression. But something guarded sat behind it now. "You don't need me anymore, Abby." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because part of her knew what he meant. Need was dangerous, especially after loss. Especially after grief finally loosened enough to let hope breathe again. That night, Wade packed quietly inside the barn loft. At some point after dark, Ben climbed the ladder carrying something wrapped in cloth. Wade looked up from rolling his bedroll. Ben held out the bundle awkwardly. "This was my pa's." Inside lay a worn brown neck scarf, faded soft with years. Wade stared at it a long moment. "I can't take that." Ben shoved his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, you can." The boy kicked lightly at the floorboard, then muttered without looking at him, "Ma doesn't know how to ask people to stay." Wade said nothing. Ben finally lifted his eyes. "But I know she wants you to." Down below, the barn doors creaked softly in the night wind. Somewhere near the house, Abby blew out the kitchen lantern. Wade looked down at the old scarf resting in his hands, then at the dark ranch beyond the loft window. Later that night, footsteps crossed the yard. Abby opened the barn door slowly. Wade sat on the same crate where he'd eaten stew his first night there months ago. Bedroll packed beside him. Lantern light moving soft across the rough wood walls. For a second, neither spoke. Then Wade gave a tired half-smile. "Thought you'd gone to sleep." "I tried." The barn smelled like hay and cedar smoke and summer dust now instead of winter frost. Abby stepped closer. "You once told me you'd stay in the barn until I didn't need you anymore." Wade's eyes lowered briefly. "Seems true enough." She reached into her apron pocket, then placed something gently into his hand. The house key. Old brass worn smooth around the edges. Wade looked at it without moving. Abby's voice almost disappeared when she spoke. "I think I need you inside the house." Silence filled the barn after that. Not empty silence, the kind that settles when something lonely finally reaches home. Outside, warm wind moved through the pasture grass, and somewhere behind the house, the water pump kept pulling clean, cold water up from the earth. By the time autumn settled over Bitterroot Valley again, folks in Red Hollow had stopped talking about the Whitmore Ranch like it was something waiting to die. The fences stood straight. Horses moved easy across the pasture, and at night, light stayed glowing in the kitchen window longer than before. Maybe that's the part that stays with a person. Not the storm. Not the broken water line. Not even the hard winter that nearly took everything from them. Just the quiet things afterward. A chair pulled closer to the fire. Boots left beside the same doorway every night. A boy laughing out near the barn again. And if you've ever lived through a lonely season of your own, then maybe you know how strange it feels when kindness finally walks back into your life, wearing muddy boots and carrying nothing except steady hands. Some people don't save us with speeches. They save us by staying, by showing up the next morning, by fixing what's broken beside us instead of telling us to carry it alone. That kind of love changes a house first, then a family, then slowly, the people inside it. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you're listening from and what moment touched your heart the most. And if stories like this bring you a little peace after a long day, there will be another one waiting for you down the road here soon. Another dusty town, another lonely soul. Another reminder that, even after the hardest winters, life still finds ways to grow again.